Trump has just helped the U.S. housing market break another record. He plans to elevate the housing crisis to a national emergency. To put that in perspective, not even the 2008 housing market collapse was declared a national emergency. Some people are saying Trump is genuinely trying to bring down home prices. Otherwise, the average person will never be able to afford a home. But others are skeptical. They point out that he has declared several national emergencies before and question which of those problems were actually solved. Will he really take action to suppress housing prices? Let's take a look at who might be the biggest beneficiaries of a housing emergency. Will homebuyers really benefit, or could they end up being trapped? The answer might be completely different from what you think. Before we start, please give this video a like. Your support is my biggest motivation to keep creating new content. The thing that has everyone most curious is what makes declaring a national emergency so different from all the previous tough talk. What exactly is a housing emergency? Let me take a minute to explain where this power comes from, and you'll understand what it means for the US real estate market. To be fair, the national emergency is not Trump's invention. It's a power granted by the National Emergencies Act, which was only passed in 1976. The original intent of the law was actually to limit the president's power. Previous presidents had accumulated vast authority through a series of crises, from World War I and II to the Korean and Vietnam Wars and the Cold War. In 1933, for example, President Franklin Roosevelt declared a national banking emergency to save the economy during the Great Depression. By the 1970s, the U.S. was still operating under 4 different states of emergency that had never been canceled. To end this constant state of high alert, Congress passed the National Emergencies Act. It stipulates that any emergency declared by the president can only last for 1 year at most and must be renewed annually. You can't just endlessly drain national resources. The idea was to give the president the keys to power in a crisis, but to change the locks every year. Nevertheless, it still grants the president 3 extraordinary powers. 1. Mobilize funds. 2. Reorganize government agencies. 3. Modify regulations. Crucially, he can do all of this by bypassing Congress and making the decision himself, which makes crisis response incredibly efficient. So this time, Trump has sent his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, to float the idea to the market. Bessent has presented 3 new keys to solving the housing crisis and bringing down high home prices. What are these 3 new strategies, and can they really save the housing market? A lot of people question whether Trump has any competent experts around him. Let's be objective. He does have some very capable people. In my opinion, Treasury Secretary Bessent understands exactly where the bottlenecks are in the U.S. housing market. Let's look at the 3 points he's focusing on and see if they match your own understanding of the crisis. First, the root of the crisis is that construction costs are too high. If people want lower home prices, you first have to control the cost of building them. Right now in the US, the cost to build a standard single-family home is staggering. I often get asked by viewers who are considering building their own home if it's cheaper than buying. Let me share the average construction costs we see on the front lines. We can break it down into 3 tiers. Entry-level homes, $150 to $200 per square foot. Mid-range homes, $300 to $450 per square foot. Luxury and custom homes, $450 per square foot and up. So for an entry-level 2,000 square foot home, the average construction cost is around $400,000. And that's before the builder adds their profit margin. So Bessent's first proposed solution is to waive tariffs on building materials to keep construction costs under control. The second cause of the crisis is that the permitting process is too slow. Bessent's solution is to standardize the approval process across the entire country, aiming to cut the time it takes in half. For a developer, time is money. Cutting the timeline in half would dramatically reduce their costs, giving them the confidence to invest more and significantly increase the housing supply. The third cause of the crisis is a stalled market. No one is buying and no one is selling. The market is frozen. People aren't buying because interest rates are too high, leaving them with no extra money for other investments or to improve their quality of life. On top of that, closing costs and other fees add up. Bessent's third solution is to lower closing costs and relax mortgage regulations. This all sounds wonderful, but don't you find it a little strange? This is what Bessent is saying in public on the front stage. But what is Trump, the man behind the curtain, really planning to do to the housing market? Many of you have already figured it out. Trump knows that with the current mess in the housing market, conventional methods are not going to work. So this time, he's having Bessent warm up the crowd with 3 clear signals: tariff exemptions, faster approvals, and lower closing costs. These are all practical steps, but they aren't enough to justify declaring a national emergency. That power must be for something else. As we discussed, a state of emergency gives the president 3 special powers. How will Trump use them to tackle the housing crisis? Let's analyze this using our 3-factor framework for residential real estate: long-term population, mid-term policy, and short-term interest rates. First, on land and population, we've talked before about Trump's idea to release Federal Reserve land. This sounds great in theory, but in reality, it's not a viable solution. In the Northeast, there's very little federal land available. In the West, while there's plenty of land, much of it is uninhabitable desert. You can't force people from California to go live in the Mojave Desert. Second, on policy, he needs to deal with the Federal Reserve. He's already been putting pressure on Fed Chair Jerome Powell. If Powell doesn't comply on interest rates, Trump can use the emergency powers to target those around him. For example, the recent investigation into Fed Governor Lisa Cook's mortgage is a perfect example of this. Once a national emergency is declared, personnel changes to influence policy become much easier. Third, on interest rates, he can accelerate the privatization of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We previously analyzed that this might not happen until 2026, but Trump can't wait that long. With emergency powers, he can mobilize funds, reorganize agencies, and make the personnel changes needed to get it done by the end of 2025. So I see Bessent's 3 proposals as the public-facing plan, while Trump is working backstage with his real power. It's a 1-2 punch. But this raises the question, who will be the biggest beneficiary of all these dramatic moves? Will it really be the average home buyer, or will the biggest winner be someone else entirely? Now, let's look at some insightful questions from our viewers. A friend asked, Trump is moving from the real estate world to the crypto world. Could his emergency housing policy actually be a way to protect his old base in the real estate industry? This is a very interesting perspective. Saving the average homebuyer might not be so simple. In my view, the home builders will be the primary beneficiaries. Why? First, the tariff exemption on building materials directly benefits developers by lowering their costs and boosting their profit margins, which in turn boosts their stock price. Second, accelerated approvals allow them to build more houses faster, which means more revenue. And finally, lower closing costs help them clear their massive inventory, which makes their quarterly reports look good and sends their stock price even higher. I'll be frank with you, based on my inside conversations in the industry, builders have never calculated how to save money for the average person. That's not their business. A capitalist's goal is to make a profit. The happiest time for a home buyer is when a builder is struggling and on the verge of bankruptcy, because that's when they're forced to lower prices. It's cynical, but it's a fact. So if the primary beneficiaries are the builders, are there any immediate benefits for the average home buyer at all? Well, that depends on where you live. A viewer from Massachusetts asked, if interest rates are brought down under an emergency, won't that just keep prices from falling because everyone will rush to buy? Does that mean all these measures will ultimately be ineffective? This sounds a bit pessimistic, but let's break it down. First, construction costs in the Northeast are the highest in the entire country, even higher than in California. A huge part of that cost is labor. During my trip, I was driving through Medford and Newton outside of Boston, and I barely saw any new construction. When I did see a construction site, the workers were all older white men. I asked one of them, a man in his 50s with a head full of gray hair, where all the young people were. He said, "The young people in this town are all in the city doing food delivery. They're not coming out here to build houses. So my honest advice to my viewers in the Northeast is this: don't pin all your hopes on a federal policy. The federal government's ability to influence the housing market in the Northeast is actually very limited. Real estate is a hyper-local business. Each town has its own council with a great deal of autonomy. For the federal government to standardize anything, they would have to negotiate with each and every council. Do they have the resources for that? If they tried, the federal deficit would be much bigger than it is now. And even if the federal government could help on a macro level, there's very little land available in the Northeast to make a difference. So who can they help? They can help the Southeast and the South, especially states like Texas, where there's plenty of land and a pro-development government that is eager to collect tax revenue. To sum up, even if Trump declares a housing emergency, the short-term benefits for homebuyers in the Northeast will be very limited. You're better off paying attention to your local community policies. Now let's look at what this means for investors. A viewer asked, is the emergency a net positive or negative for investors? And if you don't mind sharing, what are the typical profit margins for development projects? That's not a secret. It's pretty well known in the industry. And don't think of developers as just greedy villains. Objectively speaking, they are not at the top of the real estate food chain. They're actually caught in the middle. The real power lies with the policymakers and regulators at the top. A well-managed development project might have a profit margin of 15 to 20%. Large builders make money on volume. Smaller builders in poorly managed areas might have margins below 10%. And if you can't even make a 10% profit, you're going to get eaten up because you don't have enough profit to expand and buy more land. This industry is like running a restaurant. You're chained to your location and have to rely on volume to survive. You have to keep expanding. D.R. Horton is the king of volume, not the king of quality. Real estate is a business with limited space and time, so it can never be a super high profit industry like tech or crypto, where you can replicate a string of data infinitely. So, to answer the question, is the housing emergency good for small landlords? If you're a small landlord looking to expand and buy new construction from a builder who is offering discounts, then yes, it's a net positive for your acquisition costs. But an investment has two sides, cost and revenue. What are landlords most afraid of? Vacancies and tenants who don't pay rent. Does the housing emergency help you solve any of these problems? Not at all. So I believe the primary beneficiaries of this emergency will be the big builders, and the small landlords will be the ones helping them clear their inventory. I know many of you had high hopes for this emergency declaration, and I know you want me to say that this is a good thing. But my goal is to share the honest information I get from my professional network. If you believe this emergency will solve all of our housing problems, that's perfectly fine, and I wish you all the best. But my honest opinion is that when you declare too many things an emergency, the word loses its meaning. If everything is an emergency, then nothing is an emergency. The housing problem in the US is a deep, structural issue that has been decades in the making. A one-year emergency declaration is not going to fix it. So if you are serious about your own housing or investment future, my advice is to get your own financial house in order. Diversify your investments so that even if the housing market is volatile, you have a hedge in other areas. That way, you can sleep soundly at night. You won't be held hostage by the housing market. If the policy helps you, great, you win. If it turns out to be just a lot of talk, you haven't lost anything because you have other investments to fall back on. And you have to admit, no matter how wild your imagination is, you can't outthink Trump. Who would have thought that we would see a national housing emergency in our lifetime? Something that didn't even happen in 2008. I welcome you to share your thoughts. What are your hopes for this housing emergency? Do you think it can solve America's housing crisis in the short term? Thank you for your likes and subscriptions, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next exciting share.